Hey guys, so we are going to go ahead and look at our review for PFT 105 today. We're getting ready for the final exam. This is your day 12. Tomorrow we will be starting nutrition. So want to be able to kind of go through everything real quick to make sure that everybody's feeling super confident about what we are talking about. So as we are moving through it, we are looking at the study of bioenergetics. So this is going to be basically the entire chapter of your NASM chapter 4, right? So that is the metabolism and exercise metabolism and bioenergetics chapter. So when we talk about bioenergetics, what we mean is we are looking at the study of how energy is transformed through various biochemical means. My favorite way to say it is like, how do you take a burrito and turn it into squats, right? So obviously that is going to be a big part of like what your metabolism is. So we're defining metabolism a little bit differently than when you generally hear people talk about metabolism. A lot of times you hear people say it's like, oh, well, it's how fast you process food or how, you're hungry all the time. And it's like, that's not exactly what we're talking about. Like metabolism is going to be any and all chemical reactions that take place within the body. And one of the most common types of chemical reactions that are very important to us is the production of energy in a form that we can actually use, which in our body is going to be the form of ATP, right? So a lot of times we're talking about, when we're describing metabolism, we are talking about how you catabolically break food down in order to anabolically build molecules like ATP and then break those ATP molecules catabolically to release energy. So it's a lot of like building up and breaking down and building up and breaking down. So we have three main fuel sources that we're going to use in order to do this, and those primary fuel sources are going to be carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Now, your body prefers to use carbohydrates. This is our favorite type of metabolism, right? And this is used directly for metabolism. Your body is able to basically take a carbohydrate and break it down into glucose, and then once you have glucose, that can be used directly to produce ATP, right? And so glucose is a really great way to produce metabolism because it's really super fast, which means we can use it for high intensity activities. We're really good at like producing big bursts of energy whenever we use glucose. Whereas like longer sustained versions, we have a different nutrient substrate that we're going to use, which is fats. Fats are really good at like long duration, energy supply, like when your intensity is low, but you're going for like a super extended period of time. Now, going back to carbohydrates, carbohydrates are actually so good at producing energy that they are what our body prefers to store whenever we want to store immediate energy. And so we do that in the form of what we call glycogen. And glycogen is going to be stored in a couple different places, but primarily you're going to find it in your liver and throughout all of the skeletal muscle that you have throughout your body. You store it in this sort of wet, soupy mixture. And so your body's able to have like carbohydrates on the go. And that way, like if you haven't had lunch for a couple of hours, your body can tap into any carbohydrates that you might have eaten in the past in order to use that to produce energy. Now, fat, like I said, is another substrate that we use, and so our body's also really good at storing that as well. And so if there's ever like a really severe excess of calories in and an excess of nutrients, your body will convert those nutrients into triglycerides and store those within fat cells. And your body can use those triglycerides to produce ATP as well by going through a process called beta oxidation. But beta oxidation requires carbohydrates to be able to like provide the fuel source for that. So a lot of times you'll hear this phrase, and we're going to use this phrase a lot in our nutrition class starting tomorrow, but fat burns in a fuel of carbohydrates. And so when you think about like going from like a super carb heavy energy supply such as like the ATP-PC system or glycolysis, and then transferring into a more fat heavily energy supply such as in your aerobic metabolism, it kind of makes sense when you think about like intensity, right? Like high intensity is a carbohydrate burn, low intensity is more of a fat burn. And then we do have another substrate there, which is going to be proteins, right? And proteins are where you're not actually able to use protein directly to produce ATP, but your body is able to use glucose, which we already talked about. So if your body can take a molecule of protein and convert it into a molecule of glucose, that protein can now go through the regular process of metabolism. And so when we are converting proteins into a nutrient substrate that we can use to produce energy, like glucose. We're going to call that process gluconeogenesis, which is the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, such as amino acids. So if your body takes that protein, breaks it down into amino acids, takes that amino acid and turns it into a carbohydrate, bada bing, bada boom, you can produce some ATP. So looking at these different systems for producing ATP, I want to make this clear though. We're labeling producing ATP. I'm going to change this slightly, during exercise metabolism. So your body doesn't necessarily produce a lot of ATP using what is called the ATP-PC system. That's your phosphagen system. And that's also sometimes known as like your immediate energy system, right? This is really great at like using stored up ATP and synthesizing it by replenishing it really, really rapidly using creatine. That's why it's the phosphocreatine system. So your body's really good at that, but it's not necessarily like an ATP producer, right? It's more like you have a broken molecule, you reattach it, break it off, reattach it, break it off. Glycolysis, on the other hand, is really where we are taking glucose and converting it into molecules of ATP. So that's going to provide energy through the breakdown of glucose. And this is for like, you know, I generally think you should think of it as like high intensity work, and you think of the ATP-PC system as like super high intensity work, but we can call this moderate intensity, moderate duration work because it is in the middle of these three systems here. And then you've got your oxidative metabolism. Your oxidative metabolism generally tends to rely on fat as a fuel source, right? And that's going to be the most complex of your energy systems because that's using the substrates that you produced earlier on. So you took a molecule of glucose, you used it to produce ATP. Let's say you run out of glucose, but you still have like some of those materials left around. Well, your body can produce using the oxidative metabolism from a molecule of fat as long as it goes through the process of beta oxidation first. Again, an example of fat burning in a flame of carbohydrates. And so each of these kind of relies on, each of these two systems kind of relies on the wreckage of previous molecules, right? And so glycolysis will produce a little bit of ATP, but it will also produce these things called pyruvates, which will then ferment into lactic acid, and then that lactic acid will get converted into what we call acetyl-CoA. And it will go through the Krebs cycle, which is the first part of your oxidative metabolism. Meanwhile, whenever it's producing all of that ATP that's coming off, it's also producing a whole bunch of byproducts in the form of what are called NAD and FAD. And NAD and FAD are going to go through what is called the electron transport chain, which is the final part of your oxidative metabolism. And that is where you're actually going to produce a whole bunch of ATP. So you kind of rely on these previous systems to have happened in order to be able to do the further systems. Similar to how like when you're building something in the OPT model, you start by building a foundation first, and then you make a more advanced body later. Now, when we are kind of like a lot of times when we're talking about metabolism here, at least in the world of personal training, we're definitely talking a lot about intensity as well. And so we need to be intentional about our intensity. And so that's where energy during exercise becomes like a really vital concept to understand. And so we have to understand that there's an inverse relationship here, right, between intensity and duration. If your intensity is really high, your duration has to be low. But if your intensity is low, your duration can be high. And so like that is where we start to measure what is called your respiratory quotient. And this is the amount of carbon dioxide that you're exhaling versus the amount of oxygen that you're consuming. So you're always bringing in oxygen, right? And you're using that oxygen to produce energy. But you don't necessarily use all of it, right? Your lungs have the ability to bring in more oxygen than you actually need. And so if you are bringing in like 100 units of oxygen and you are exhaling 70 units of CO2, well, that means that you burned up 70% of the oxygen that you brought in, but 30% of it didn't get used. And so you have an RQ of what we call 0.7. And that's actually where your body is primarily using fat as a fuel source. That's a super low intensity, long duration thing. Chances are you're sitting at home right now watching this video, you're probably around an RQ of 0.7 right now. So, you know, you're burning fat calories, which is nice, right? Now, as we continue to do higher and higher intensity, you know, we're starting to recruit more and more muscle fibers, which means those muscle fibers are just starting to get recruited, which means they're starting to go through the process of glycolysis because that's kind of where things start, right? So now we're starting to consume more and more oxygen in order to be able to supply the fuel for all of that. And so as we are at a full sprint, eventually, if you were to bring in 100 units of oxygen, 100 units of CO2 would be exhaled because you would use all of that oxygen in order to process that glucose in the later stages of your aerobic metabolism. So you would end up like burning all of that oxygen up for fuel, right? And so then you're exhaling all the byproducts, which is CO2. And now the ratio between that is 100 units in, 100 units out, which means all of it's getting used. And that's when you're at a full sprint. This is where carbohydrates are the primary fuel source, because you are primarily relying on glycolysis right here. And that's an RQ of 1.0. So there's only one time a day when we're ever at an RQ of 0.7, that's going to be when you're sleeping. And there's only one time a day whenever we are at an RQ of 0.1, and that is when you are sprinting at maximum intensity. So typically exercise is taking place in some blend of those two numbers there. Now, how do we determine what blend to give somebody? Like if I am trying to figure out how the right intensity to give somebody, I need to consider a lot of things. I need to consider what I know about metabolism, and I need to consider the rules of intensity, right? We know that the principle of overload is really important. We have to work at intensities that are great enough that cause our body to trigger a growth response, but we also have to make sure that we're doing it safely, right? And so the three main things that we're going to consider are the type of exercise, the intensity of that exercise, and the duration, right? And these are all very tied together. You can't do very hard exercise for extended durations. That's very dangerous, and your body can't sustain it. So the type is going to be the, whether the objective is to increase your health or your well-being, the type is irrelevant. And we have to make sure that you're picking a type that is going to work you at an intensity that's hard enough in order for your body to create change, whether that's swimming, sprinting, rowing machines, lifting weights, whatever it happens to be, right? But once we consider that, then we also need to consider the intensity. And so that's going to be determined by your duration and your frequency, right? So duration, it's the function of how often you're able to kind of continue doing something, right? And so if your duration is super high, your intensity must be low, right? Again, there's that inverse relationship that we talked about. Now, generally, we're going to break this down a little bit more complicated. Generally, NASM is going to recommend that you use your FIT principles, your frequency, intensity, time, type, and level of enjoyment in order to, monitor these kind of three main key differences here. And that's just being a little bit more specific, which is always very, very helpful. Now, we're going to kind of finish up our talk on cardio where we're talking about if you are working to develop an aerobic energy system, right, develop your cardiovascular system, you need to make sure that you're giving your clients enough intensity in order to apply that principle of overload. You also want to make sure that you don't go too hard so that they can't do it. If I make you work really, really hard right out of the gate, you're going to be exhausted. And then if I'm trying to develop your endurance, I literally can't because you're too tired to be able to continue working on endurance. So we have a couple different methods here for prescribing intensity that you're primarily going to focus on. One of them is the Karvanen formula. This is also commonly known as the heart rate reserve method, and this is going to calculate the difference between your maximum heart rate and your resting heart rate. And that way, if I know what your highest intensity is and I know what your lowest intensity is, that's going to allow me to pick something somewhere in between. So if I'm taking the difference between your high intensity and your low intensity and being very specific to you by measuring your resting heart rate and your max heart rate, well, then I'm going to be able to prescribe a pretty darn accurate version of intensity for you. Now, it's not always perfect, it definitely has its flaws, but it's one of the best methods that we have access to. Then we also have our rating of perceived exertion scale. This is that RPE scale, and that's actually asking your client to rate how difficult they feel the exercise is. If they feel that it's very, 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 very challenging, then the RP is very, very high. And if the RPE is very low, and you are trying to raise their intensity, you can say, okay, you said that this intensity is on a scale of 6 to 20. You said this is around an 11, which is below exercise. So I want to make this a little bit more challenging for you. Let's see if we can get that up to about a 14. Let's start by modifying this exercise, raise one leg up off the ground, right? So that little tiny adjustment might be enough to get your client into the area that you want them to in order to experience change. Now, this works really well with strength training, but is primarily used in cardio, which is why it's up here. in sort of the cardio section. Now, speaking of cardio, the one final method that's always very popular as well is also measuring your exercise intensity by using what is called the talk test. And the talk test basically measures intensity by taking into account how difficult it is for your client to speak. If you want somebody at a high intensity, then it should be pretty difficult for them to hold a conversation while they're training. If you want them at a medium intensity, they should be able to speak, but it should be fairly uncomfortable. And then if you want them to be able to, continue doing like endurance type exercise where they can do super long durations, well, then they should be able to hold a conversation the entire time. Now, talking about strength training, when we're looking at training for strength, we got to understand that you don't just have one part to a movement. Like a lot of people think that it's like you're going to go to the gym, you're going to move a weight, and then you're going to walk home, But that's not exactly how that works, right? You're doing continued repetitions of all of the different ways that your muscles contract. And so we have to understand those muscular contractions. You have concentric contractions, which is where your muscles are generating a greater amount of force than whatever resistive force they're working against. So if I had a 5-pound dumbbell and I'm generating 10 pounds of force, I'm going to overcome that overcome gravity's effect on that dumbbell. So my muscle is going to shorten, and that is a concentric contraction. Now, the opposite of that is an eccentric contraction. If I were to lengthen my muscle out because, I've got a 5-pound dumbbell and I'm only generating 2 pounds of force, gravity is going to win that battle. And so my arm is going to lengthen. That is going to be an eccentric contraction. And then isometric contractions are where you're actually stabilizing and holding something in one place. And so this is a contraction that occurs when your muscle's really not changing any length. Now, isometric contractions are really great, but they do tend to raise your tension inside the body very, very high. So we do need to be cautious there and make sure that if we have a client who has hypertension, for instance, we're not going too heavy into the world of isometrics, because that can actually lead to even higher blood pressure. Now, you can't talk about training for strength without talking about flexibility. And so, we have a couple different methods for applying flexibility here as well. We have static stretches, which are these stretches that you tend to think of when you think of stretching. Generally we associate stretches with these long, big duration stretches. And that's really what a static stretch is, right? These are slow, long, gentle stretches that are held for 30 seconds, sometimes even up to a whole 2 minutes. And they're going to rely on a process called autogenic inhibition. The reason static stretches actually work is because when you stretch a muscle out, you're putting pressure on this little sensory receptor called a Golgi tendon organ. And that Golgi tendon organ is communicating with a muscle spindle. Now, the Golgi tendon organ's job is to sense how much tension there is at the bone, and the muscle spindle's job is to sense what length the muscle is at. So if you lengthen a muscle out and put tension on that Golgi tendon organ, you're simultaneously poking the Golgi tendon organ while also stimulating the muscle spindle by having it in an incredibly lengthened position. So the muscle spindle's freaking out, and the Golgi tendon organ's happy to freak out as well, until you hold it for about 30 seconds and that Golgi tendon organ starts to realize there's actually very little tension here because you are doing this stretch very gently. So what ends up happening is that actually triggers an inhibitory effect where the Golgi tendon organ sends an impulse to the muscle spindle that says relax, and that actually allows your muscles to fully lengthen out. Now we've also got active isolated stretches, which are stretches that if you ever think of an activation technique where you might pull yourself into a stretched position and then relax, and then pull yourself into a stretched position and then relax, and do multiple repetitions of that, that is active isolated stretches. And those take advantage of a process called reciprocal inhibition. Your nervous system is designed to turn antagonists off whenever you contract their opposite muscle. So if I were to contract my upper back, my brain is going to send a signal to my pectorals that say to relax it. So if I give that 5-10 repetitions where I'm continually sending relaxation signals to my pectoral muscles, it may result in increased mobility. And that's why active isolated stretches work. They take advantage of that reciprocal inhibition process and organization of our nervous system. Now you also have dynamic stretches. Dynamic stretches are actually where you're going to use your body's momentum to pull a muscle through its full range of motion. These are really great because they're excellent at improving blood flow and tissue temperature and things like that. The only thing about them is they're not really used to improve actual mobility. We're not sending signals to our nervous system to, relax those muscles. We're simply drawing those muscles into a lengthened state. So they're very likely to tighten up back afterwards. But they are really great pre-workout. They're just not used for mobility improvements. And then we have PNF stretching. And PNF stretching is actually going to take advantage of both of these processes, autogenic and reciprocal inhibition, because this is going to get the benefits of active stretches and static stretches simultaneously. So what you're going to do is these are stretches that require a partner to actively stretch the participant into a lengthened state. And you're going to hold that for about 20 to 30 seconds. And what that does is that actually creates that autogenic inhibition that we talked about. It's going to inhibit those overactive muscle spindles. And then we are going to have them contract that muscle, which is going to create reciprocal inhibition by telling the nervous system to turn that muscle off actively. And we're going to hold that contraction for about 7 to 15 seconds. And you're going to repeat that 2 to 3 times. So you're applying basically the best parts of autogenic inhibition with the best parts of reciprocal inhibition. So now we've understand a little bit about metabolism, and we understand how our body is going to develop cardiovascular fitness, muscular fitness, and flexibility. And that should get you guys through your final exam. If you guys have any questions, feel free to give me a call or shoot me a text. But everybody, good luck. We'll see you for the review tonight. And if not, then we'll see you for class tomorrow. All right, see you guys.